Hello, I am the Hearth Guy, and this is a supercut of my series on the tactical RPG Triangle Strategy, and the countries, factions, and characters that make up the world of the game. Due to the formatting of these videos, which are a little bit better planned than my Fodland ones were, you'll only be seeing current Hearth here at the start, so let me just get it out of the way now that I am incredibly grateful to everyone's support and appreciation for the series. Triangle Strategy was a bolt of lightning kind of game. Here today and gone tomorrow, which was really unfortunate for such a uniquely down-to-earth world, with an intuitive form of decision-making and tactical combat. It struck me a lot as all the right things I liked from games like Fire Emblem and Dragon Age all at once, refined and put into a single package that remains a consistently good time even with a few years of hindsight. I dare say it aged better than Fire Emblem Three Houses, which is wild for me to say, I know, considering Three Houses got me to where I am now. But even so, I really wanted to draw more attention to the game again, and maybe help spark conversation about it, even if only for a bit. Because it's one of those unique gems that I'd hate to get forgotten in the full month after month of game releases. So, as a love letter to a game I hope doesn't get washed away by the salty breeze over distant sands and shores, this is the complete tour guide to Norzelia, the great northern continent of salt, iron, and burning conviction. Triangle Strategy, funky name aside, is a pretty great game. A sophisticated but accessible tactical RPG that employs active and reactive decision-making both in combat and with the many choices it offers you across the over 100 hours of gameplay available. With 3 conviction stats which are empowered by the choices you make and allow for different decisions being easier or harder to achieve, and different people joining your cause. Coalescing into 3 primary endings and a special golden ending if you do everything just right. It's been 2 years since this game came out and it's still an absolute banger, although people don't seem to be talking about it much, with there being a boom of content near the game's launch which fizzled out afterwards. Let's change that. Hello everyone, I am the Hearth Guy and welcome to Norzelia, the land of salt, iron, and the river that connects it all. Each of these necessary lifelines to the continent are controlled by a different power. Salt, which is very essential to life when it isn't pouring out of Twitter, is controlled by the holy state of Hyzant. The river and the fertile lands needed to capitalize on its waters are controlled by the kingdom of Glenbrook. And the continent's supply of iron is found in the northern mountains which are dominated by the Grand Duchy of Esfrost. These 3 monopolies have fought each other over their respective resources for a long, long time. And the antagonists to most of these fights have been, who else? The frozen nation with red-toned color scheme. There's no empire in this game, but if there was, it would be Esfrost. Admittedly, the Grand Duchy of Esfrost kind of has the short end of the stick compared to both Hyzant and Glenbrook. Glenbrook has wide-open territories filled with variable resources that don't include salt. Salt's vital, but it's not everything. Because Glenbrook has all these resources, it's the one that primarily is trading with Hyzant for its salt and getting paid for its resources. But Esfrost? Besides iron and the special techniques for molding it they alone know, they've got to take from both. That's not always easy with their bad blood, which has led to Esfrost developing in a very funny way as it has by the time of Triangle Strategy. There are 4 endings to this game as I said, which tend to align with one of the major factions of the game, and one of them is Esfrost, who, despite technically winning in at least 2 of those endings, is doomed to either a slow and painful decline or a quick and chaotic shattering under its own weight. Speaking of, let's do some video game history. The lands that would become Esfrost have been occupied perhaps as long as Norzelia has been, as despite both Glenbrook and Hyzant claiming to have existed first, it was definitely Glenbrook. The mountain folk seem to have identified as neither group, and were up there around the same time. Or if they did come from either of them, they splintered off long before and journeyed to the mountains, developing an entirely unique culture. Here they found the abundance of iron and very little else, and got to work, setting the foundations of ironworking Esfrost would be built from. While everyone south of them muddled around with bronze, they got busy pillaging their neighbors with superior weaponry. At a certain point, Glenbrook got sick and tired of having all their stuff taken, while Hyzant was probably just chilling in the desert. Odd phrase, I know. So the, at the time, King of Glenbrook sent House Esfrost to deal with the clans. This house was directly related to the ruling king, likely from some closer relative like a great uncle or something, and their army eventually brought order to the north and a duchy was established under the house's control. These southern folks, well accustomed to trade, looked around, saw the people of the mountains and said, "You know what they need? industry. And like Andrew Carnegie, they turned the manufacturing of metal not into just a major part of the economy, but a cornerstone of it. The entire continent would collapse without them now, which is likely why, when the dynasty ruling over Glenbrook shifted to a different branch family, which they liked to do a lot, Frost called them all fakers and seceded to keep maxing out that industrialization perk tree. Along the way, they took the horse-sized birds of the mountain called Great Hawks and started telling their heavily armored people to ride them. And it worked. So, the Frosty military started becoming the pride and envy of Norzelia. There was just one little problem, and like most problems in Norzelia, it started with Hyzant. Hyzant, the desert theocracy to the east, was home to the Source, a wide salt lake that was the only source of the stuff in all of Norzelia, and with that monopoly came economic and existential power over the other nations. Glenbrook could get by well enough on its own, but Frost would have been practically chained to Hyzant, something which grew more and more unacceptable to the duchy. So what did they do but bury the hatchet with their old cousin Glenbrook and ally to break Hyzant's monopoly? Both sides, especially Frost, stockpiled salt before rushing Hyzant on the same day they declared war, giving the capital little time before it shut its gates for a prolonged siege. But a siege would not be what Frost would get, as the Hierophant of Hyzant of the time sent a request for aid from the only other sort of major player in the region, House Wolfort of the central north region of Norzelia and its lord, Simon. With a rapid response, the Wolfort army broke the Frosty siege and forced the war into a protracted position, with Glenbrook and Frost in the north and west, and Hyzant and Wolfort in the east and south. And as you can no doubt imagine, that means a continental war, one that lasted 30 years and began draining everyone of so much needed resources. Even Glenbrook, which had all the farmlands, and Hyzant with all the salt, started to feel the pressure. Especially Hyzant, after the Hierophant up and died of cringe or something. Worse off for Hyzant, but better for the continent's moral standing, a rebellion broke out amongst the Roselle, an enslaved caste of people who Hyzant culturally gaslit into serving them, and a large population of them escaped into Wolfort territory, weakening Hyzant further. Some of these left for Frost, including a woman who would become the consort of Archduke Siegmund, and eventually lead to the birth of Lady Frederica Frost. More on her later. Frost, meanwhile, was running low on salt, manpower, and willpower, and Glenbrook was certainly not helping, as its king Regna schemed in the background with Simon Wolfort, eventually leading to a forced stalemate where the more advantageous Glenbrook and Wolfort armies told Frost and Hyzant to either stop fighting or to fight both of them. Like if 4 guys are fighting, 2 have knives and 2 have guns, and then the 2 guys with guns turn them on the knife guys after the knife guys already stabbed each other. Naturally, Frost and Hyzant weren't going to refuse. In the negotiations, Frost gained nothing and got a forced restriction on how they could sell their own iron, as they were no longer able to arbitrarily limit the distribution of iron. In other words, their own economic power was stifled with the creation of the Norzelian Consortium, an international economic organization meant to control the trade of all the nations. Unfortunately, in times of peace, one needs salt a lot more than iron, so guess who the consortium favored on a whole? Glenbrook, who betrayed Frost, got itself more territory and the 3 high houses to bolster its defenses and check the power of the aristocracy. Meanwhile, Frost was left with nothing but debt and an angry Hyzant who still controlled the salt, as well as a shortage of labor and a stifled ironworking industry due to Frost suffering from the most casualties in the war. The Consortium, which was meant to help balance the trade of iron and salt to help revitalize both nations, instead centered the international economy on the salt trade, leaving Frost to fend for itself, which caused poverty and a growing black market. And then the Archduke Siegmund died, and his son, Gustadolf, took the throne. Gustadolf was a severely different Archduke, and the reforms he implemented changed Frost overnight. A revitalization of the army, the economy, and its national pride, all under the meritocratic regime of the new Archduke. A regime where humanism was celebrated in the face of the struggle. If you could contribute to society, you were uplifted and given all you needed. If not, then you were left to the wayside. Gustadolf made a country already prone to struggling build its entire culture around the very concept, where all had to struggle and could gain power for themselves. And on a whole, it worked. People did rise to the occasion. Many found new opportunities in Frost not found elsewhere, and Gustadolf cared not for one's origin or the peculiarities of their character, only their results. And so, anyone had a chance, regardless of class, origin, or gender. Something not afforded so easily in Glenbrook, and certainly not in Hyzant. Esfrost was always individualistic and ambitious. Gustadolf simply made the very society function off those merits. But many also suffered. Gustadolf encouraged people to rise up by any means necessary, and he followed that same formula. He put down his own uncle Svarog and sent him to the border to keep him away from power, although he did allow his cousin Dragan a lot of privileges due to his development of explosives and engineering, as well as his study of salt. But Gustadolf remained the master of Esfrost, and to play his game was to understand that he was always the winner. And Dragan forgot that fact. Dragan's study into salt and iron led him to be made overseer of the Grand Norzelian Mines, a project to sow unity between nations on the surface anyway. Esfrost would do the unthinkable and share some of its metalworking secrets with Glenbrook and its now vassal Wolfort, and would share in the revenue to come from a new iron mine in northern Glenbrook. Gustadolf even arranged a marriage between his half-sister Frederica and Simon's only son, Serenoa Wolfort, as a show of good favor, but that was just a smokescreen. Dragan found something in those mines. Salt crystals, something previously thought impossible, and Dragan tried to leverage it to gain power and become prime minister, a position held by Gustadolf's brother Thalus, and Gustadolf almost considered it, if Dragan just hadn't threatened him. Dragan said if he refused, then he'd go to Glenbrook, so Gustadolf took drastic measures. He sent a squad of assassins to have Dragan killed, and then, preempting the backlash, marched on Glenbrook before news of Dragan's death could get out, and attacked under the lie that Glenbrook had killed Dragan to steal the mine's resources for itself. An unprepared Glenbrook fell under the might of Gustadolf's prize General Avlora, and he had the Crown Prince and King killed summarily, with the second Prince Roland on the run in Serenoa Wolfort's care. Then Gustadolf forced the remaining Princess Cordelia to be engaged to him to secure his legitimacy as the new ruler of Glenbrook, while rapidly applying his meritocratic reforms over the capital. Wait, what was that first part? Seeing the absolute chicanery at play, Hyzant entered the fray, and we had ourselves the Salt Iron Warp Round 2. And from there, the story of Triangle's strategy really unfolds. Those who've played it know that it is a dense game with a tree of branching decisions, so there are many ways every playthrough can go, but this video is about how things end up, and in this case, for Esfrost. As the primary instigators, they're obviously the villains, and have a good first foot forward. But I have a number of reasons and examples of why no matter what route you choose, they almost always end up doomed to fail. Let's start with the obvious, the Liberty route, where you side with Esfrost, give them the secrets of the salt crystals, and fight Hyzant. Well, frankly, this is probably the most humiliating outcome for Esfrost, because Gustadolf doesn't even get what he wants. In the Liberty ending, when Serenoa listens to his advisor, Benedict, and joins Esfrost, ousting Roland as the heir to the kingdom, long story, he inherits control of the salt crystals as well as the research of Dragan, which he left behind to Serenoa upon his death. Meaning, by approaching as an ally, Serenoa held all the cards that Gustadolf needed. Even more so, since with Dragan's research, they could use the salt crystals better than Esfrost would ever have been able to. By this point, Esfrost has combined all its knowledge to create the Death Snell, a massive cannon capable of destroying city walls in a single shot. But military power is rendered useless when the economy of Norzelia is now held in the hands of Serenoa. Or rather, with Benedict, Serenoa's advisor who pushed him down this path. Either way, Roland leaves, refusing to ally with his father's killers, and Serenoa leads Glenbrook alongside Esfrost to destroy Hyzant and break apart their monopoly, as well as freeing the Roselle. But the price for that freedom is felt immediately. When freed, the Roselle are essentially cast to the wind by the new regime as Glenbrook adopts the measures of Esfrost, which it had begun to grow comfortable under Gustadolf's rule, and Benedict is rather partial to it himself. These nigh Darwinian societies are not welcoming to the recently freed Roselle, forced to become stragglers in a world they are wholly unfamiliar with, and one that has grown attached to the ideals Gustadolf aspired to, survival of the fittest. But while Gustadolf raised up those who proved themselves, Benedict's version of this ideal demands people lift themselves up entirely, and all are put on the same expectations, even the Roselle. All while Gustadolf himself is proven to be unfit, while Glenbrook under Serenoa seizes the reins of power over the continent for the foreseeable future. Meanwhile, Roland, set adrift, plans to start a popular revolution to overturn this new world with the remainder of Hyzant's government. Meaning the Roselle, who face discrimination and struggle in their new freedom, receive no special treatment from the monarchy, and all must live their own way. In this world, as the game itself states, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So in this version of events, Gustadolf and Esfrost start a war, are pushed back, have to ally with the people who just slapped them around, and then get sent right back to square one while the people who they invaded get all the rewards. There's something poetic about that. And with Esfrost back where it started and Glenbrook opening up the salt mines and the source to the free market, Esfrost can't profit off it any more than Glenbrook could. So he's doubly out of luck. Doubtless, in a few generations, Esfrost would be subsumed by Glenbrook as well, and Norzelia would be unified under a colder dynasty than even Gustadolf could have ever made. But how about the other endings? Let's look at the morality ending, where Serenoa sides with Frederica's plan to free the Roselle and abandon Norzelia by traveling south into uncharted lands. Well, imagine all I said about what Esfrost lost just now and instead give it back to them on a silver platter, because Hyzant is busy falling apart due to a slave rebellion that leads to half their leadership dead. With Roland abandoning Glenbrook alongside Frederica and Serenoa, as does the entirety of the Wolfort army, they take the secrets of the salt crystals with them as they chart a way forward for the Roselle. Glenbrook, left without any kind of leadership, is quickly taken over by Esfrost once again, and Hyzant collapses into civil war while fending off Gustadolf, who is also fighting his own civil war once his uncle Svarog begins fighting back with his own death snell. Turns out he found out about Gustadolf killing his son. All the while, Gustadolf's plans are set with a very powerful new ally in Benedict, who abandons Serenoa, refusing to leave the Wolfort territory. And with his tactical mind, the regime Gustadolf intends would no doubt descend upon Norzelia in the bloodiest way possible. Peace would be all but an illusion, with unrest a constant problem. The Roselle may be gone, but people would still have to work for the salt and iron, and this land in need of repair would find no gentle hand to guide them. Only the cold iron fist of Gustadolf's liberation. So the question of course becomes, how long until the revolution comes? How long until another war to upset the upsetting of the status quo? Gustadolf may keep the peace during his reign, but how about after? Who will come next that can hold back the floodwaters of Glenbrook and Hyzant having been for the most part abandoned by his leadership? The religious authority of Hyzant would either be reborn in a more fervent form, or it would crumble and Hyzant would lose major parts of its identity. Glenbrook might fare better in certain areas, but the civil war in Esfrost now affects Glenbrook too, as it's become Esfrost territory. And Gustadolf has to manage a territory close to 3 times what he originally had, with far more people and resources. So have fun with that one, Gus. As for the utility ending, well, Roland decides slavery is okay if more people are prospering than those suffering. Benedict and Serenoa are okay with it. Frederica gets mad and leaves, but not before she drops the sun on Serenoa. He's fine. And then they ally with Hyzant to destroy Esfrost, ending with Gustadolf's death and Svarog blowing up the capital in an eruption of molten metal. So yeah, it's not great for them there either. As you might expect, the golden ending is better for Esfrost, though even then it isn't pretty. Gustadolf dies and Esfrost gets annexed by Glenbrook, reunifying the territory under the kingdom as it was long ago. And Gustadolf's meritocratic regime is done away with. Svarog becomes the new governor of the territory while the problems of iron and salt vanish, since now all Norzelia is under the flag of Glenbrook, and therefore there's no need for a corrupt international trade bureau like the Consortium. Because there's no need for international trade when all the nations are one. Well, sort of. The territories of Esfrost and Hyzant are largely self-governing in this ending, but let's be real, the people who are given those positions were given to them by the king of Glenbrook, so we all know who's in charge. Esfrost as it was is no more, and once again it's a vassal to Glenbrook, undoing a long line of independence. So thanks, Gustadolf. Your war to make everyone just as miserable as you ended with your country either blown up, reconquered, back to square one, or at its best in the middle of a 4-way civil war. And in the end, that meritocracy of his didn't really turn out to be all that great, huh? We see the consequences of it both in Esfrost and the Liberty ending. Sure, you could argue it's the fault of Hyzant's monopoly or the effects of the war, but sit down and think about it. Starting with the fact that every meritocracy is shackled by the fact imperfect humans are determining what is of merit. In this world of Gustadolf's, you can try as much as you like, and the door is open. But it's open for 1,000 others as well, and all are rushing to pass through. Frederica herself puts it best about her homeland. The freedom of opportunity is promised, not success. Some can make themselves rich beyond their wildest dreams, while some will find themselves crushed beneath the weight of it all. This is the price of freedom in Esfrost. That's why I feel calling what Esfrost represents liberty is a bit of a misnomer. Because liberty and freedom are not the same thing. Freedom is about the ability to act as you please, while liberty emphasizes the accountability with those actions. Consider it within the context of the phrase, "with great power comes great responsibility." In this case, that power is the power of free choice. Liberty, therefore, is that power with responsibility. It is freedom that limits itself of its own free will as to not impinge on another's freedoms. That's the difference in Esfrost. The people of Esfrost are free, but they are far from liberated. Something to be noted is that in each ending, which is given one of the 3 convictions as its title, the actual ending does follow those convictions, but only on the surface, missing key parts of the picture. Take the example I just set forward and apply it to the Liberty ending, also known as, rather fittingly, the Endless Path, and you'll see it for yourself. It's a free world, but not a liberated one. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer, while the path upward is open and cramped, and while food is scarce for the lesser, and the undercurrent of revolt stirs. This is the endless path Esfrost started, and Glenbrook walked down under this new era of liberty. And it's that same path which would inevitably lead to the destruction of Norzelia under Esfrosty rule, no matter how things end. In short, Gustadolf is very good at setting the stage for violent revolutions. Thanks a lot, pal. It strikes me that so many of these problems could have been solved if Esfrost had never cut itself off from Glenbrook. A shame, really. After all, Glenbrook seems like it's got it made. Reasonably temperate all year round, control of the Norzelian River and pretty much all the farmable land, a weak king backed up by an increasingly corrupt noble class, so right. Now I remember why this place blows. You know, I think pop culture has predisposed us to thinking kingdoms were great places to live. King Arthur, Fire Emblem, Chronicles of Narnia, the list goes on. Knights in shining armor, noble kings, maybe some god or wizard that blesses said king, you get the picture. But really, monarchies kinda sucked. Only controversial opinions here, obviously. More often than not, you had crap living conditions, were legally and economically dependent on your landlord, and you could die from either a headache or the insane treatments your local medical practitioner came up with to treat said headache. Don't get me wrong, some monarchs were pretty chill, and I will stand by the idea that Cyrus the Great could outlead any world leader today. However, for every Cyrus, we have a dozen Henry VIIIs. If you really want an example of why kingdoms are statistically designed to make living in them nightmares, look no further than Triangle Strategy and the Kingdom of Glenbrook, likely the oldest still standing civilization in Norzelia, ignoring Hyzant's propaganda. Glenbrook seems to have started as a bunch of smaller tribes or houses during a time when the central plain of Norzelia was covered in dense forests. It of course is no longer like that now, as it has been deforested heavily. But with the emergence of Whiteholm, a powerful commercial hub at the intersection between the 2 great rivers of the continent, the surrounding areas began to become more settled. This hub became the capital of the emerging kingdom, with a founder whose blood would persist to the current era, even if the specific ruling house would change. Even early on, Glenbrook was primed as the continental superpower, with almost all of Norzelia, minus the Wolfort territory, and Hyzant under its control. Frequent flooding threatened Whiteholm and the lower breadbasket, but over time they'd create a dam and a reservoir to fix that issue. They did wind up shifting the ruling families a few times, which caused the territory of Esfrost to secede, but even after that they remained in a pretty good position with the rivers between them and their larger competitors. A whole water source to themselves, access to the primary sources of food, lumber, and, well, space that wasn't covered in snow or sand. This developed a mild-mannered people with attitudes as temperate as their climate, save for those in Whiteholm who usually found themselves easily influenced by others in the economic capital of Norzelia. But uniting them all is a hefty sense of tradition, customs, and social etiquette, which are the guideposts for navigating society at every level. Overall, the kingdom was pretty nice. On the surface. See, countries need to be run by people, and the king or queen was just a single person. So they needed help from... bureaucrats. Nobles, to be precise, though they don't appear to be actually owning land, and instead function as essentially an entire class of clerks and representatives for the monarch. So, hereditary bureaucrats. Great. As anyone might be able to guess, the ultimate outcome of this is a heavily entrenched political class, steeped in corruption, regularly bickering, and only taking action when money is involved. Because this is fantasy. Deja vu aside, these royalists, as they were called, began becoming a major problem for each successive generation of rulers, limiting the scope of the king and the people's influence. There were also a faction called the Loyalists who respected the king, but they don't matter because they never succeeded in doing anything. This buffer between the highest and lower classes created by the Royalists allowed them the ability to shape the internal societal structure of Glenbrook, enforce laws, and regulate the people, all while making a little bit extra for themselves. Then, Esfrost, the former vassal of Glenbrook, comes along and asks if they want to end the monopoly of salt that Hyzant, their eastern neighbor in the desert, has. And the king goes for it. Under the condition, Esfrost accepts the king's line as the rightful rulers of Glenbrook, which the Archdukes of Esfrost had refused to do since their secession. This war gets messy, however, as the nearby clan of Wolfort backs up Hyzant and extends the war to a whole 30 years. Glenbrook's reigning king Regna began to realize the pointlessness of this war, and so went on his own and reached out to Simon Wolfort. Together, Regna and Simon dragged Esfrost and Hyzant kicking and screaming to the negotiating table, but Regna himself had his own ambitions. He wanted a political faction to counterbalance the Royalists and lower their influence across Glenbrook, and he saw the chance for that in the House of Wolfort. With the end of the Salt Iron War, Glenbrook made out like a bandit, gaining land and centralizing the trade of iron and salt within the Norzelia consortium, which made it more accessible for kingdom subjects. Regna also got 3 new vassals, Simon Wolfort, Landroy Fox, and Silvio Tellior, the latter 2 being subordinate members of House Wolfort that were given their own lands and equalized to Wolfort. This was partially to weaken the Wolfort clan in case they ever decided to get uppity. These 3 high houses took control of the lands of Wolfort in the center of the continent, the southern grainlands which were taken by House Fox, and Tellior took the northern reservoir and vineyards, all lands conveniently between the central kingdom and Esfrost or Hyzant. In an instant, these 3 houses weakened the Royalists' control of the common people, especially in those territories, and became almost as popular as the royal family. But even then, the high houses didn't become the antidote Regna wanted it to be. Instead, the 3 houses busied themselves with administering to their own lands rather than politicking, so the Royalists still held a grip on political power within the capital. This corruption festered across the 30 years between the Salt Iron War and the events of the game, and even members of the royal family got in on it. Patriot, the head of the Royalists and the head of all this corruption, was allowed to engage in further fraud by King Regna as a way to prevent further conflict inside the hierarchy. This underhanded deal was learnt by Regna's oldest son, Franny, from Patriot, who manipulated Franny into weaponizing it against his father to ensure his position as the appointed heir above his younger brother, Roland. Roland was, to Regna, the preferred candidate to succeed him. He was a free spirit that frayed against the restraints of his station but held a genuine love for his people and the ideals of chivalry. Though his father stayed distant, partially out of jealousy for his own son's sense of freedom, he believed Roland was the proper choice. But to ensure the corruption remained unseen, he gave Franny assurances for his future place as king, passing over Roland. And so the rot grew deeper still while Regna tried to manage problems within his realm, like the growing trade war between Hyzant and pretty much everyone else, as well as Esfrost's growing belligerence. To prevent a second war, Regna orchestrated the sharing of the Grand Norzelian mines, a patch of stone where iron had been found and with Esfrost's assistance could be properly utilized. In the same move, Regna made a powerful alliance, though one that was seemingly innocuous, between the heir of Simon Wolfort Serenoa and the half-sister of Archduke Gustadolf, Frederica. This joint venture should have ensured peace for another generation, but machinations beyond Regna's control were at play. After an attempted power struggle between Gustadolf and his cousin Dragan, attempted because Dragan was killed very fast, Esfrost launched an invasion of Glenbrook, one that was unimpeded by the high houses. Wolfort's elite army was busy at the Great Norzelian mines trying to defend Dragan's life, while its main army was held up in Wolfort territory following Simon suffering a near-fatal heart attack. Falks, far in the south, was unaware until it was too late, and Tellior did nothing, because Silvio Tellior is a coward and an opportunist to his core. With the high houses failing entirely and the royalists wholly ineffective, the capital of Whiteholm came under Esfrost's control quickly. Franny was killed in the taking of the throne room. The champion of Glenbrook, Sir Maxwell, took Roland away at the cost of his life, and the youngest, Princess Cordelia, was forced into a role as the puppet queen, set to be married to Gustadolf. And poor King Regna was sentenced to death and blamed for it all. A lie made by Gustadolf claiming Regna had tried to seize control of the mines he made to ensure peace. a lie Regna reinforced in an effort to save his own children from Gustadolf. Regna's death would mark the true beginning of the power struggle within Glenbrook, as the Royalists spent the knee immediately to Esfrost, although rather than new shiny positions they were expecting, they found themselves reduced to menial tasks under Gustadolf's meritocratic reforms. From there, the story of the game expands based on the player's choices, but some things remain true. Landroy Fawkes is slain by an agent of Esfrost, either General Avlora or Serenoa Wolfort after surrendering Roland and giving in to Esfrost's demands. Silvio Tellior attempts to curry favor with Serenoa, Esfrost, and Hyzant, all at different points, but his cowardice is revealed and he is forced into hiding, before ultimately trying to switch sides to Hyzant in the end and dying for his trouble at Serenoa's orders. Another consistent truth is Cordelia plotting against Gustadolf behind his back and eventually gaining the loyalty of General Avlora, though this would ultimately go nowhere as her brother was secretly still alive. Furthermore, Wolfort winds up in an alliance with Hyzant once again, but with the ever-growing tension between the two exacerbated by the presence of a Roselle village in Wolfort territory. With those tensions ignored, to a degree, they attack the capital in one of three ways: destroying the Tellior Reservoir to flood the capital because Benedict has some internalized hatred for his own country, I think, an attack at night to cut off the castle from the city because Frederica is the one saving grace of this whole army some days, or sneak inside and attempt to assassinate the Esfrosti leaders because Roland is out for some personal revenge. No matter how you choose, the outcome remains, with Roland returning triumphant to his rightful throne, freeing his sister and forcing Esfrost on the back foot, only for him to have the crushing weight of his new role as king come down around him, all while Glenbrook finds itself in an interesting position, lied to by the very people who invaded their country and given a whole new series of rules under Esfrost's meritocracy. A more open economy with less restrictions that let people in the capital make more for their work. Now, some of that is fueled by a war economy, no doubt, but that's a whole other theoretical factor. Overall, for people used to the corruption, greed, and overreach of the Royalists, their new Esfrosti leadership was looking pretty good. So when Roland came back and tried to implement the old status quo, the Royalists were happy to comply. And by happy to comply, I meant they ramped up their blatant corruption to whole new degrees. Stealing necessary supplies in broad daylight, increasing taxes dramatically, and arresting those who resisted as insurrectionists. Petriet stands at the forefront of all this as he attempts to take that opportunity to assassinate Simon as well, just as he's recovering. This ultimately succeeds, but Patriot himself winds up dead, either at Roland's hands or at Serenoa's, splintering the Royalists but drawing the ire of his own people, who blame him for the noble's actions. Glenbrook isn't doing very well by this point. Even if you don't flood the capital or whatever, they're down major building blocks of their society. The high houses are cut down to one that's already been shouldering the entire war effort alone. The Royalists are gone with Roland's violent retribution. The Loyalists have never been relevant, and both Roland and Cordelia are hated for being seen as a tyrant and a puppet, respectively. The weight of Roland's lofty ideals and the expectations as a king, the deaths of his family and friends, the scorn of his people, and the smoldering threat of war that persists even then, it all comes crashing down as he searches for anything to lift this burden to allow him to shirk his responsibilities. And we reach the final decision point of the game. The three options offered are as I explained in my last video. Benedict suggests allying with Esfrost to finally curb Hyzant's control over salt, especially as Wolfort has discovered salt crystals, which could break apart Hyzant's control. Frederica plans instead to sneak into Hyzant's source and set free the entrapped Roselle and leave the continent altogether. While Roland has a different idea. Roland has decided to place his faith in the holy state of Hyzant and the teachings of their goddess, to lay down the freedom of the Roselle and all who oppose Hyzant to secure equity for the broader population of Norzelia. The freedom of the Roselle would all but vanish, any splintering of beliefs or inconsistencies of fact would be erased, and all would be found as equal in the eyes of the goddess. So, yeah. Glenbrook's doomed. Legitimately, no matter which of these you choose, things are obviously bad for Glenbrook, but most of that is entirely Glenbrook's own fault. Choose Benedict's plan, and as I covered in my last video, Glenbrook becomes a cold, Gilded Age-esque kingdom where the divide between rich and poor grows under the reign of a new king, Serenoa, who supplants a refusing Roland. With Frederica's plan, Glenbrook is abandoned by the last slivers of leadership and hope they had and are taken over by Esfrost with ease, forcing them to be a part of Gustadolf's increasingly belligerent war for total freedom, while civil unrest shakes the continent on all sides. And Roland, oh dear stupid Roland, If we follow Roland's plan, he abdicates the throne of Glenbrook and is instead made a minister under the Saintly Seven of Hyzant, alongside Serenoa. With that new designation, they give every Roselle remaining to them over to Hyzant to suffer in slavery and strife so the majority of the continent can thrive. They also hand over the salt crystals and all knowledge pertaining to them so no divisive information can contradict the sacred teachings of the goddess. In one fell swoop, Hyzant takes control of the most bountiful land in Norzelia, and the only other source of salt, signing the death warrant to freedom. Even the cold and harsh freedom of Esfrost would be preferable to the lie Hyzant has in store. But that's a story for another day. On Glenbrook's side, things begin looking better. The masses receive plenty of salt and goods under Hyzant's purview, while dissidents in Roselle are made to suffer in the mines and the source. The cost for Roland's abandonment of his duties. Then there is the golden ending. If you do everything just right, Serenoa can offer another path forward that ends with Gustadolf dead and his uncle Svarog in control, allowing for an alliance with Esfrost, as well as the Roselle set free from the source and Glenbrook united under a reinvigorated Roland, who has come to see the error of his ways and regained his hope. Roland just needed to have Serenoa show him not to bend in the face of expectations, and he did that by defying the choices left in front of him to create a new one. In the end, to cut a long story to be elaborated on later short, Esfrost and Hyzant are brought under the greater wing of Glenbrook, with King Roland overseeing it all. The three high houses are gone, as are the royalists, and they're replaced by three governors, each overseeing major parts of the continent, those being the Wolfort Domain, Esfrost, and Hyzant. The needs of the people in all corners of Norzelia can be met as the three nations finally work in true friendship, with the salt of the source and mines not hoarded anymore. The golden ending is really the only one where Glenbrook has even half of a chance at real recovery, and even that admittedly will take some time. But in this case, there's less of a chance for war from their neighbors when their neighbors are a part of them now. Imperialism. Sort of accidental imperialism, but still. Roland also matures as a better king, more firm in his beliefs and less willing to hand over all his responsibilities to someone or something else just because it'd be easy. Because that's what Roland's choice and the utility ending were. The easy option. But with the golden ending, true freedom is achieved as well as true safety and equality among the people. For now, at least. Three territories of vastly different cultures all bound together and expected to work with each other is not always a recipe for success. But in this case at least, half the leaders are all related to each other. Long story, we'll get to it later. So the long-term viability of this experiment is bright. No thanks to the people of Glenbrook who crashed their head against every wall and blamed it on someone else. Probably the worst part of this is how no matter what, the people of Glenbrook never learned their lesson. The folks of Wolfort have to suffer through all this, Esfrost must learn the real meaning of freedom, Hyzant has to shake off centuries of religious indoctrination, and the Roselle just want to be left alone. But the people of Glenbrook? No. They blame everyone who is in power for their current shortcomings, blame whoever comes next for the problems the people before had, give themselves over to the first new face they see, and then only seem happy whenever they don't have to think too hard for themselves. Because fantasy. Maybe I'm being too harsh, but these people are very quick to believe whatever is told to them and go along with it until it's too late to turn around. In every ending that is shown, and when the golden ending comes around, the people only start being happy about it because Roland went and got a big victory for all of them. I swear, these people are sheep. Thankfully, it's not them who is doing most of the fighting, but Wolfort. Those people have some backbone, and it seems they rubbed off on Roland just in time for the golden ending. Because he grew into just the kind of king they needed, the kind his father and brother never could have been. One who is free, one who is kind, and one who is strong. We're still going to clown on him for his stupid idea. You know, I said a lot of mean, hurtful things about Glenbrook and Esfrost, and maybe that was beneath me. I need to look forward to a better future, to be kinder, more equal. Because for as bad as they are, oh boy is Hyzant worse. In a distant land far to the north, there is a desert protected under the gleaming providence of a goddess and her hierophant, whose words bring peace and equity to all who bask in her presence. Unless you have pink hair, in which case you're going to the salt fields. Hello once more, I am the Hearth Guy, and I am back in Norzelia to discuss the third major faction and story pivotal force in the excellent triangle strategy, the holy state of Hyzant. We've covered parts of Norzelia's history before, but Hyzant really is a beast all to itself, with plenty of problems baked into its sandy and salty surface. Whether it's, well, the obvious moral duplicity, or the oft-overlooked questions of freedom versus equality, Hyzant has been festering in a very concerning and very dystopic view of perfection for a long time. So sit back and grab a snack, because we're about to do some history. No preamble needed, because we've been here twice before, and because this is going to be a little bit more complicated. Now, Glenbrook is most definitely the oldest still-standing country in Norzelia. But don't let Hyzant hear you say that, as they've been claiming that since their inception, doubling down that Glenbrook must have obviously falsified any records that suggest they've existed longer than the Holy State. Ignore the evidence of mass book burnings. You have no proof. Regardless of which side was oldest, it's clear that since its beginning the people of Hyzant have indeed followed the teachings of the Goddess of Salt and her Saintly Seven. The Saintly Seven are a council of ministers that all oversee essential aspects of the country. The leader is the Hierophant, who speaks only to Minister Idor Delmira, the religious minister, who in turn gives direction to the ministers of salt, war, medicine, domestic affairs, and the vice minister of religion. In the time of the game, these are respectively the corrupt Sorcery End, the ambitious Exarm Martial, the brilliant Lila Viscraft, the zealous Camsel Ferrant, and the pathetic Tenebrous Mistel. Within the ministries and within the country itself, in the name of equality and prosperity, freedom of choice is limited. The Saintly Seven determine for each of its citizens the path of their lives, especially their careers, which ministry they enter, how they pursue that career, and what they are allowed to do with that training. Together they light the way forward for the people of Hyzant, instilling their beliefs in the goodness of the goddess and her ways, while ensuring that all remember that non-believers are beneath them, and the Roselle who toil in the goddess's source deserve their fate. The Roselle are a people signified by their rose-colored hair and eyes, and have been enslaved by Hyzant for as long as anyone can remember, with the story going that they once tried to hoard the blessed salt granted by the goddess for themselves, until the goddess and her chosen people of Hyzant overthrew them and punished their wickedness. Now even the Roselle are indoctrinated to believe that the only way they may achieve paradise is to struggle and die for the goddess in her source, to pay for the sins of their ancestors, all under the eye of a statue to the goddess, which the people believe is the goddess herself brought down upon the land. Even if you believe that story, Hyzant has gone far beyond simple punishment or reparations. The Roselle are the backbone of their very society and are treated as less than dirt. Roselle are seen as unclean by birth and only washed clean in death. It's a belief system stacked against them from the start for the act of being born. But it continued regardless for a long, long time. Hyzant grew around the source and the Roselle's services, and their monopolies surged their economy to new heights. Neither of their neighbors of Glenbrook or Esfrost could feasibly live without the salt they alone provided, and that money brought prosperity to Hyzant's people. They constructed a massive and thick wall around their capital known as the Goddess's Shield that no siege had ever broken, and formed a masterful cavalry from the desert horses to navigate and defend the sands of their homeland. Though maybe not the most powerful army, they were definitely the best funded and most passionate. This army is backed up by the robust Ministry of Medicine, that spends its every waking second investigating, researching, and applying their knowledge of the natural world and magic to combat every disease or wound that may be inflicted on their soldiers. But it's also a haven for darker research. Poisons, weapons, deadly magic, all of it under the roof of the Ministry of Magic and its leader, Lila Viscraft, who herself is a master of time magic. But her greatest and darkest creation came during the time of the Salt Iron War, when Esfrost and Glenbrook launched an attack on Hyzant to break its monopoly of salt. With the goddess's shield shut tight, the Hierophant called out to the only force that could help them, Simon Wolfort, leader of the Wolfort clan in central Norzelia. Simon's small but elite army allied with Hyzant's, and they shattered the siege of the capital, and forced the battle lines back to the Norzelian River. Now, I have something of a correction or clarification to make. Whenever I've referred to the events of the Salt Iron War, I usually said they happened over the course of 30 years. This may or may not actually be the case. Usually in the game, it's referred to as having happened 30 years ago. But, of course, it's kind of vague as to the length of time. I'm not sure if it began 30 years ago, ended 30 years ago, or lasted 30 years. It's very unclear with its language in that regard. Based off things we'll get into later in this video, I'm inclined to believe it was a little closer to the events of the story than, say, possibly 60 years ago, but I'm, again, unsure. With that in mind, the years during the Salt Iron War would mark massive shifts in Hyzant as it struggled to combat the changes, especially as the Hierophant became ill and something even more problematic happened. The Roselle revolted. Led by a woman named Orlea, as many Roselle as possible took up arms and fought back, damaging the statue of the goddess overlooking them. Then, in the chaos, these Roselle fled from the capital and scattered in many directions. Some went straight to the Wolfort domain where they would be safe, while others were captured at the Citadel of the Sands, the frontline garrison of Hyzant. The at the time Minister of Arms Archibald fought the greatest general of Esfrost, Groma, at the legendary Battle of the Citadel, while these Roselle were imprisoned here. And in a moment of near tragedy, Groma lit the Citadel on fire to burn out her enemies, and would have burned the Roselle alive, if Archibald had not had a change of heart. He freed the Roselle, allowing them to escape west as he suffered grievous wounds holding the Citadel as long as he could. In the end, Archibald would lose an eye and a leg for his troubles, and exile himself out of shame and disillusionment with his own people, eventually finding a place within the Wolfort domain. Down one minister, and with the Hierophant's illness turning for the worse and ending in her death, the Saintly Seven collapsed in on itself, as the remaining members fought for control. And during it all, the once idealistic Idor del Mira saw the true nature of man, the selfish want in their hearts, the blind craving for more that comes to the surface as soon as the illusion of peace and prosperity is shattered. And so he sought another solution. And that solution would come in the form of Lila Viscraft. Now, time and ages are a little funky in triangle strategy. We aren't 100% sure if Lila was around during the events of the Salt Iron War, and we don't know if what she ended up creating, which we'll get to in a minute, started being worked on back then either. But here's what we do know. Idor would blackmail and manipulate Lila, something which would ultimately force her to send her infant son into exile out of fear for what Idor would do to him. Again, this is evidence which would suggest that all this starts to happen later on in the timeline, as said child, Quahog, is not very old by the events of the game. What Idor would have her work on would be something truly awful. A creation formed from the bodies of the dead Roselle to be specific. After all, there are plenty of slain Roselle every day. By taking their bodies and their souls, harnessing and compressing them into a raw magical energy, Lila created the device which would lead Idor's new ideal, the Aelfric. A gemstone of unimaginable destructive potential that could be used both to destroy and to power, such as when he made Lila use the Aelfric as a power source for Idor's real scheme. A mechanical Hierophant to replace the dead one. With a new voiceless leader that he could speak the desires of, Idor became the true leader of Hyzant with a puppet of his own design. With Aelfric as a possible superweapon, he felt more assured than ever of Hyzant's future superiority. Which would work out for him anyway, as, again, regardless of when all of this happens, the Salt Iron War drew to a close, with Glenbrook and Wolfort forcing negotiations. The ensuing peace deal favored Hyzant in the end, with the Norzelian consortium preferring to focus on the salt trade, which allowed Hyzant to adjust its taxes and tariffs as it pleased to enrich itself at the expense of Esfrost. So, over the next 30 years, Hyzant recovered its strength and its economy, while wringing as much as it could out of its neighbors and the Roselle once again. The ministers I mentioned before all come into their positions, with Exarm being the youngest and most renowned, quickly distinguishing himself as the vanguard and theocracy. Again, it's likely around this time that Lila would have come in, although it's hard to tell considering the likes of Camsel were around back during the Salt Iron War. We don't get a clear, definitive timeline, so I'm doing my best. That enriching itself at Esfrost's expense had dire consequences, however, as Esfrost and Hyzant's relations grew worse and worse, prompting Glenbrook to engage in essentially diplomatic showmanship to encourage peace. This was done with the Grand Norzelian Mines project, which Hyzant signed onto to remain in the loop and not get shut out by Esfrost. Tension was high, of course, but Hyzant largely minded its own business, until Esfrost invaded Glenbrook, deposed and executed the king, and threw House Wolfort to the wind. Hyzant in turn notices the swaying House Wolfort and sees an opportunity, or at least some members of the Saintly Seven do. Sorceley decides to take Wolfort under his wing, whether they approve of it or not, based on your actions in the game. But regardless, Sorcery involves himself in the clan and therefore drags them into Hyzant's politics. Inevitably, Serenoa, the new leader of House Wolfort, plays his part in exposing Sorcery's corruption, which leads to Sorcery's brutal execution. And upon that day, Serenoa Wolfort became the new Minister of Salt, and Hyzant demanded his loyalty. But regardless of the path chosen to get there, Esfrost forces Glenbrook to cease all trade with Hyzant in order to push it into surrendering the source, and Hyzant's involvement in this new war was assured. From there, Hyzant took part in the retaking of Glenbrook while trying to strip Wolfort away from Glenbrook's control once Roland returned to his throne. All the while, Roland is struggling against the weight of a war-torn nation, an ongoing political civil war that he has to put down violently, and a public straining between the world they knew under Glenbrook and the one they knew under Esfrost. There's also another wrinkle in the plot: salt, and the fact that Hyzant's monopoly was in danger. Upon the discovery of salt crystals, whether found earlier or later is dependent on whether the Serenoa gives up the Roselle in his territory as Hyzant demands, but no matter what, Wolfort and Glenbrook come into possession of a salt crystal, and later learn that the Grand Norzelian mines are full of them, which serves as a threat to Hyzant's power. More importantly, it serves as a threat to Hyzant's dogma, which pushes the idea of Hyzant's superiority, which is bestowed in the form of salt in the source, a gift from their goddess which ensures Hyzant knows it's culturally and intrinsically better than its neighbors. If salt can be found elsewhere, then the very identity of Hyzant would fall apart, and their control over the Roselle would fall apart right along with it. So, as a Hyzantian minister and vassal of King Roland, Serenoa is ripped between the two forces, all while being forced to reconcile Esfrost's continued aggression and the Roselle's fate. When push came to shove, the decisions faced before him are as we've covered before: abandon Norzelia and take the Roselle with him and Frederica, turn to Esfrost and have Benedict bargain with the mines to destroy Hyzant, or follow Roland's plan and give both the Roselle and the salt crystals to Hyzant and embrace their vision of equality. And of course, Hyzant's ultimate fate is determined by these choices, and more often than not, it's not pretty. Except in this case, it's most of the time it's not pretty for everyone else. For starters, obviously, when you free the slaves that a slave economy is built upon, said economy pretty much explodes. But Serenoa and Frederica don't stop there, as they kill half the remaining Saintly Seven on their way out, including Lila, Camsel, and Edor, leaving only Exarm and Tenebris around, the former of which controls the military, and the latter which likely would take over Edor's place. Almost immediately, a civil war is confirmed to have broken out between the two remaining members of the Saintly Seven, and the Hierophant is completely inactive due to Edor no longer being around to puppet it. All while Gustadolf is running roughshod across the continent in a better position than he was before Serenoa and Roland retook the kingdom, meaning Hyzant was likely to collapse in short order. Following Benedict's plan, we actually take part in the destruction of Hyzant ourselves, allowing unrestrained access to the salt mines and leveraging Esfrost's help in invading Hyzant, which leads to Exarm's death in battle and ending in Edor sending the Hierophant out to cover his own escape. The Hierophant's true form exposed and soon broken, Hyzant is pushed under the reign of King Serenoa after Roland dipped because he ain't about to side with his father's killers. Their religion, culture, and pride shattered in a new realm that takes their ideals of equality and breaks them in the name of freedom. Under this order, Hyzant would become a shell of its former self, the one thing it had, being salt, now no longer being as exclusive and no longer something they alone can exploit with free labor, while the leadership, such as Edor, escape into the background to plot and revive the goddess's teachings, which could very well be possible considering Edor holds the secret to Aelfric. But then there's the utility ending, where you go along with Roland and cede power to Hyzant, an act which alienates Frederica irreversibly and makes her abandon Wolfort and Serenoa. The salt crystals are handed over, the Roselle are sent to their final fate, and Hyzant embraces Glenbrook as a new part of the goddess's realm, before turning their eyes north to the last bastion of resistance. In the name of their new goddess, Roland, Serenoa, Benedict, and Exarm lead the army that breaks through the gates of Esfrost's border and confronts Gustadolf in his capital, fighting tooth and nail to ensure the freedom of his vision and his people. But he too is lost. While he demands Roland give in and kill him out of revenge, Roland cast off such human emotions when he took this path, embracing the mind of a utilitarian, at least on the outside. Though he plays the role of this being simply for the greater good, in the end Roland chose the easy way out, abandoning his responsibilities and leaving it up to Hyzant to decide right and wrong for him, and by extension, all of Norzelia. So just as he burned away his own humanity and the freedoms of others for this gilded equality, Svarog Esfrost burns away the capital in a sea of molten metal, ensuring the legacy and knowledge of Esfrost dies with the dreams of freedom. The future Svarog and his son dreamt for so long dies, while Svarog becomes the last witness to what once was the people of liberty. Of course, whether he did that or not was irrelevant, since X-Arm had been sent to burn the Esfrosti archives, to ensure no information that could sow dissent or contradict the teachings would find their way out. The destination was preordained, just as Roland had intended, and just as Hyzant always taught. The land of equity, but not equality. A people who were brought up to believe in their superiority built on the backs of others. That is who winds up controlling the whole of Norzelia. Hyzant, despite its shiny exterior, clung tightly to the ideas of utilitarianism beneath the image of faithful and peaceful people. Its leadership becoming self-serving as the path of utilitarianism always leads. The name for the utility ending is a world free of sin, and it is such a world only because that sin is denied existence, denied attention and reality. This world free of sin is a lie, a falsity as it has ever been, where the act of personal free thought is abandoned for security, forced equality. So thankfully, in the golden ending, Hyzant faces a true, absolute end. In this one, where Serenoa presents an alternative choice compared to the three proposed before, Svarog takes control of Esfrost after Gustadolf's death. Benedict defends the Wolfort domain and its people from X-Arm, and Frederica successfully frees the Roselle and slays Camsel in the process. These strings of victories mount as the combined power of Esfrost and Glenbrook turn on a weakened Hyzant, shattering their defenses and marching into the city. X-Arm dies, Camsel dies, Lila almost dies but is granted mercy before, and Tenebris gets himself obliterated to power a special Aelfric, one that Idor had planned for the coming future. One he uses then and there. This Aelfric was designed to power something greater than the Hierophant, something not bound by the restrictions of man or machine. Something with the freedom to act and the resolve to persist beyond human life and comprehension. A demigod. Idor Delmira started this all so long ago, and now he stands to finish it. To see his perfection come to pass by enforcing it personally. Once he believed if he prayed enough the goddess would descend and save his people and change their hearts. But she did not answer, and in time he came to know she was a falsity. So Idor decided he must save his people himself, to become the god they so long for. And this Hyzant is a reflection of his twisted beliefs. For you can't trust people to be wise, you can't trust them to make the right decision or to understand the weight of their actions. Free will spreads fear and doubt, the pursuit of justice leads to collapse, freedom creates greed, and reality breeds discontent. Of course, even upon taking this power to become a demigod, it would be too little too late against the united power of all House Wolfort, and every one of their allies who come together to shatter the false saint. In one last death, ending the nightmare that was the holy state of Hyzant Idor created. With only Lila remaining, Hyzant's last semblance of leader cedes her country's defeat, and all Norzelia is wrapped into the flag of Glenbrook, where Hyzant can perhaps truly heal itself of its wounds beneath a new flag and a new governor, Lila, who not only would find redemption for the horrors she committed, but would also find the son she long thought lost. So too can the Roselle at last find peace, and the lies of the goddess's teachings would vanish from Norzelia and the hearts of its people. It's impossible to say, of course, how Hyzant will change from that point forward, but in the world they wind up in, it's a far cry better than what they had, gilded equality or no. In that way, at least, the dream Idor once had at last came true. I think we're all big enough to admit when we need help, that we can see ourselves at our lowest point and recognize that, yeah, it's bad. But I also think we can say that no matter what happens, and no matter how bad it gets, at least you're not a Roselle, because sweet lord is every single second of their lives consistent pain, fear, and misery. Will someone please just leave them alone? In Norzelia, salt is the very core of life. It is needed for everything from food to medicine to simply keeping the body healthy. But here there is only one source of salt. The source. It takes back-breaking work to comb the salt from the waters, sift it, and consolidate it in such a way that it can be shipped out in mass quantities. It's a lucrative business, but a hard one. At least it would be if you had to pay for labor. Oh yeah, this is going to be that video. Hello, I am the Hearth Guy, and this is yet another part of my tour guide to Norzelia, covering one of the most crucial and often demeaned groups within the northern continent of iron and salt, the Roselle. The very people who the salt part of that whole deal is built on. And I do mean built on, and of. Their bodies, their blood, sweat, and tears for countless generations is soaked into the salt and water of the source, and the fate of Norzelia is intrinsically tied with theirs. Because once upon a time, they tried to save it. They tried to stop the needless violence, and was met with it instead. So sit back and relax as I tell you of the one group of people in this entire bloody land that literally did nothing wrong. Long, long ago, the land was covered in a great sea, until a terrific cataclysm rent the land apart, forcing the waters to recede. Land became clear, and the salt of the sea remained in the ground itself, though the people who would travel to this new northern land could not have known that. The only salt they saw was a great lake in a vast desert, and these people fought to control it. In time, as early tribes and clans formed and became nations, the group that would conquer the sands grew to a greater power. But as their control over the essential salt became threatened again, from the south, from the shores of another great sea in the land of Centralia, there came the Roselle. The Roselle understood the secrets of salt and the crystals, so they came and dug up a great pillar of salt crystals to show the people of Norzelia that they didn't need to fight and kill for salt. And the desert folk would not allow it. They hunted the Roselle, slaughtering them and rounding up what remained. They took the salt pillar and hid it within a statue at the center of the source, and that statue would become the face of this new golden nightmare, Hyzant. They created a new history, a new faith, and a new enemy. The Roselle became reviled and blamed for attempting to hoard the salt for themselves, and as punishment, they would be made to suffer before the eyes of Hyzant's false goddess. Told every day for generations that they were a tainted people who could only be made clean with their deaths and servitude. This would be their fate for centuries. While kings and nations fought over the salt that they produced, the Roselle's spirit and culture broke bit by bit. But still, they yearned to be free. And while the continent-spanning Salt-Iron War raged and Hyzant was in disarray, one woman saw a chance. Her name was Orlea. She rallied her people to revolt. The Rosellan Rebellion, try saying that 5 times fast, created a whirlwind of chaos in the capital city of Hyzant, during which Orlea struck and cracked the statue of the goddess, a scar which allowed her to see the salt inside. Taking a chunk of it, which was all she could carry, she led as many as she could out of the city and westward. The groups from there splintered. Some were captured and held at the Citadel of the Sands. This included Orlea, who was captured trying to lead more Roselle out of Hyzant. However, as the Esfrosti General Groma burnt the citadel to the ground, they would be released by the Minister of Arms, Archibald, who had always felt conflicted with the actions of his homeland. In this act, though he'd later lose his position as a member of the Saintly Seven and he'd exile himself to Glenbrook, Archibald ensured the future of the Roselle had some hope. After their flight from Hyzant, most found refuge in the domain of Simon Wolfort, an ally of Hyzant who had grown disillusioned over the course of the war. Still, more would scatter across the lands in small, often hidden groups, and Orlea herself would find herself with her people in Wolfort territory, where she hid the chunk of salt in hopes that it might be used to reveal the truth of the Roselle and Hyzant. Alas, it was determined by the leaders of the Roselle that now was not the time to reveal such a truth, to prevent even more conflict falling upon them. Soon after, perhaps out of disagreeing with her peers or seeking a place truly safe from Hyzant, Orlea went north to the Duchy of Esfrost. Here she caught the eye of the Archduke, Sigmund, and was accepted as his consort. Besides being a Roselle and discriminated against based on that, Orlea was unpopular just by the nature of being a consort while Sigmund was already married. Regardless, Orlea had some peace in Esfrost while she wrote down all that she knew and kept it sealed by magic which would only respond to the presence of a certain amulet, one she passed down to her daughter, Frederica. Frederica's life too would be hard, relentlessly tormented by her half-siblings Thalis and Erica, and always wearing the burden associated with her hair, and she'd soon bear it alone. As Hyzant and Esfrost worked to rebuild relations, Hyzant had only one demand of Archduke Sigmund: return Orlea. And he did. Without hesitation, Orlea was torn from her new home and her daughter, and sent back to the nation that she had given everything to escape from. And there she would remain, until she died in misery and heartache. Sigmund would not be long for this world after that either, and Frederica would be almost entirely isolated, save for her uncle Svarog and cousin Dragan, who were sent to live at the border. And though her eldest brother, Gustadolf, treated her fairly, he was far from a warm person. The only kindness she had to hold was Gila, her tutor and mentor, who Sigmund assigned to Frederica at a time I assume to be shortly before his passing, since Svarog has not changed much between then and Gustadolf sending him to the border after his ascension to the throne. Gila's teachings would bring Frederica up with a deeper knowledge of magic and a desire to pursue the freedom of others, a dream Frederica believed would be fruitless until a new treaty was to be signed, one between the three nations around the Grand Norzelian mines, and the union between herself and the son of Simon Wolfort, Serenoa. The young couple, arranged into marriage, were a token sign of unity between Esfrost and Glenbrook, two minor but tangentially significant figures paired together for the sake of appearances. If need be, both could be cast aside should conflict begin again. And conflict, of course, began again, because people are terrible at just communicating. This time over the discovery of salt crystals, a revelation that Dragan and Gustadolf had only theorized on, now proven true. With Dragan's death via an assassin sent by Gustadolf and Esfrost invading Glenbrook to cover their own backs, a new conflict began with Frederica and Serenoa at the center. Her new home of Wolfort traded around by Esfrost and Hyzand in their game of chess. Frederica's own role in Wolfort would be as one of its leading members, one of the few with a token that gave them the power to vote with the scales of conviction. Alongside Benedict, Serenoa's advisor, Gila, Prince Roland, Roland's bodyguard Huet, and Serenoa's two retainers, Eridor and Anna. As you likely know by now if you're already aware of the game or have seen my other videos, the story of Triangle Strategy expands from there based on your own choices, and the choices of these 7 characters. Frederica will begin as usually pushing Serenoa and by proxy the player towards more humane and open-minded decisions, such as defending Roland whenever Esfrost demands you give him up, or revealing the corruption of Sorceley End, the Minister of Salt from Hyzand, who begins trying to ingratiate himself to House Wolfort. Sorceley is another piece of the Roselle's suffering. As the current Minister of Salt, it is his duty to oversee the source and the Roselle's treatment, and corruption is a lackluster way to describe his handling of them. Brutal, cold, inhuman, amongst others, but his corruption, one way or another, would come to light, whether House Wolfort reveals it themselves or not. And either by doing Hyzand a good turn by doing so, or by being strong-armed to owe them a favor, participating in the corruption, Serenoa is given Sorceley's position as Minister of Salt, and expected to behave like it. And for that, he, Frederica, and Roland visit the source itself, and see just what her people have become. Toiling in the scorching sun, indoctrinated to believe that their very lives are blighted and made to worship in the direction of the statue of the goddess, not knowing that within it is the key to their salvation, that ancient pillar of salt. The Roselle's relationship with the Wolfort clan is pivotal in these moments, as Serenoa is also commanded to return any and all Roselle in his territory to the source, to prove his loyalty to Hyzand, whose aid they need to defeat Esfrost. Again, you're given a choice to acquiesce or not, and obviously Frederica opposes this, and you have to make that choice. Now, whether you refuse to do so, or whether you actually hand them over like the monster you are, the game leads to something of the same outcome. Sort of. If you refuse to hand them over, then you have to find a bargaining chip, and that is of course the chunk of salt crystal hidden in the village, used to convince Hyzand to ignore the Roselle for now. If you hand them over, Hyzand is happy to help you and you retake the capital of Glenbrook all the same. In both cases, they allow House Wolfort to bear witness to another affront to God and nature, the power of their secret weapon, the Aelfric, a magical gemstone that is actually the compressed magical energy found in a certain renewable resource. People. The Roselle. Though revealed separately across different endings, the fact remains the same. Aelfric is created from the use of dead Roselle as a means to power automatons and cause massive destruction, and the choice of the endgame comes into view. After Glenbrook is taken, knowledge of the salt crystals winds up in the hands of all sides, and the three nations gear up to fight over them. Wolfort's final decision will determine the future of Norzelia, and most especially the Roselle. The choices before you are simple, and ones we've covered before. Take the salt crystals and leverage them for an alliance with Esfrost, as Benedict wants, hand them and the Roselle over to Hyzand, as Roland wants, or follow Frederica's plan to free the Roselle and abandon Norzelia in search of their motherland of Centralia. Benedict's plan seems like a compromise on the surface, but it's not exactly helpful for the Roselle themselves, at least not those freed from the source and then displaced. The ones who already have homes and enclaves to call their own might fare better, but the newly freed slaves are thrust into a new society ravaged by war with nothing to their names, and expected to make a life for themselves in competition with thousands of others who have had far more opportunity. Possible? Yes, but far from easy. Especially with how Benedict, through Serenoa, decides to reshape Norzelia. Hyzant may be gone, but life doesn't just magically become easier in the world created by Benedict's ideas of liberty. The Roselle in particular face rampant discrimination and the same limiting of resources that everyone else in the lower class does during this ending. And all through it, Frederica from her position as the new queen could do nothing but watch and adhere to the principles put in place. Forced to watch her people suffer from on high in a cold marriage to a man who'd lost his heart in pursuit of the ideals Benedict crafted for them. In terms of losing heart, however, the utility ending is far worse. As you can imagine, choosing to sell out the Roselle and the salt crisps to Hyzant is a line Frederica will not cross, up to the point of challenging Serenoa to a duel. She's ultimately defeated and banished. She does not give up. While the Roselle all across Norzelia, including those who had once lived free, are made to suffer in the salt mines and at the source, Frederica will continue her crusade in the shadows, teaching of the truth of Centralia to those who will listen, and spurring a feeling of rebellion against the new status quo. In this future, the path back towards even an ounce of freedom they once had is no doubt long and arduous, filled with uncertainty. And though Frederica, like her mother, may not live to see it come to fruition, the seeds she plants now may one day lead to a revolt even greater than the one Orlea had sparked. Then there is the morality ending, which is frankly the best for the Roselle, even compared to the golden ending. Here, the Roselle from across Norzelia are unified and granted liberation by Frederica with Serenoa and Roland's help, granting them protection as they cross from Norzelia into the south in search of Centralia. While the continent burns itself down, Serenoa leads his army to right the oldest wrong Norzelia is stained by, even to the point that he sacrifices his life to prevent Idor, minister of Hyzant's religion, from killing them all. The only evidence left of him being Orlea's necklace, which Frederica had gifted to him. Still, the Roselle do escape. They leave the land that had forsaken them behind to its fate, while they finally make it to Centralia, and the great salt sea which the Roselle had left generations upon generations ago. This ending, called Calm Waters, is fitting for the new tranquility that Roselle and the army of Wolfort find in this land. The likes of Roland, Gila, and all the others in the Wolfort army now following the new Lady of Wolfort, Frederica, just as the Roselle do. A new home for an old people with the chance to make a nation free from the baggage of the northern lands. Of course, the question always remains whether history could repeat itself. Whether again the Roselle will reach out to an embittered Norzelia that has grown under the blood and strife Gustadolf brings, only to be met with violence and subjugation again. Or worse, if Norzelia really becomes united under this violent new regime, will they eventually turn their eyes south to the lands the Roselle have created for themselves and once more seek to take it for themselves? The sad truth is that by leaving Norzelia behind, they leave the future up to the hands of those remaining, and none of them are kind. Even if Gustadolf were to somehow lose, which is unlikely, Norzelia would remain in a period of conflict for generations. Battle lines drawn and redrawn again and again, while, by the game's own admittance, the source and salt change hands too many times to count. So, with yet another much larger source of salt to the south, a united and belligerent Norzelia could quite easily become a conquering force intent on taking from the pacifistic society Frederica and Serenoa hope to create. Also, who is to say the society they'll make will really be all that nice? There could easily be more Roselle who never left Centralia, who have their own cultures and customs that suddenly have to deal with an influx of people who have been disconnected from Centralia for centuries. If this society is unwilling or unwelcoming, then the calm waters could become stormy far faster than it would take for Norzelia to come calling. Or worse, an internal struggle could ignite in the lands as well, and the people Frederica had hoped to free from war could be embroiled in another one. This is all speculation, admittedly, but it's the unknown which always ruins even the best-intentioned plans. The unforeseen variables that turn the most idealistic and well-laid plans into complete failures. The flash forward in the ending of Calm Waters suggests that, at least in the end, the Roselle do find peace in Centralia, but these possibilities always will remain. That said, it would make for a great sequel. I'm just saying, Square Enix, call me up. The greatest drawback, of course, to all these endings, even the morality one, is that Frederica loses the man she comes to love each time. Liberty sees them both grow cold and distant. Utility, he betrays her people and bows his head to the very country that enslaved them. And in the morality ending, he dies bringing about the freedom she had insisted was necessary. In that respect, the golden ending really is the best ending, as he is able to free the Roselle, reconcile with Esfrost without succumbing to their ideals, and break Hyzant's teachings and its monopoly of salt, preventing the enslavement of the Roselle ever happening again. Norzelia itself is also not thrown to the wolves, and Serenoa is left in charge of the Wolfort domain, where the Roselle are liable to resettle, meaning that with a happy marriage to Frederica and the likelihood of future heirs carrying Roselle blood, the Roselle would officially have a representative on the continental stage. They'd finally have a true home where they could grow and be free, while also growing alongside the people of Norzelia. The very dream that Orlea and Frederica both wished for comes to pass thanks to Serenoa being able to create a future of his own making, independent of what others had tried to push onto him. Not to mention, with Esfrost coming under control of Svarog as its governor, pro-Roselle sentiments are more likely to spread, since Svarog has always had fondness for his niece. With the repentant Lila Viscraft as the governor of Old Hyzant territory, that same attitude will no doubt be part and parcel with everything she enacts as governor. An air of reconciliation and reparations is no doubt to become the norm in Hyzantian society. And of course, Roland, best friend to Serenoa and Frederica, has gotten over that little bout of insanity and has become a champion to the common people, ready and willing to listen to both of them as time goes on. Just, don't anyone ask him what his idea was. It'll probably bring back war flashbacks. So the arranged marriage that was intended to be little more than a disposable token became not only something truly genuine, but the cornerstone for an era of hope and change, an age where the Roselle are at last able to live free. Norzelia is a rather small place when you really look at it, unless the map is just that deceptive. It's no surprise that each nation entrenched itself where they are and didn't change much. There was also almost nowhere else to go. And yet, they all still keep coveting that one spot of land between them all that has been stubbornly refusing to give up for the entirety of their history. Like a entire faction of anime protagonists. Because no matter what time or era, the great house of Wolfort always controls the scales of history. You know, there's something very funny, very stupid, and very realistic about an entire continent's history hinging upon the actions of a comparatively tiny faction that has all the right pieces to screw with everyone else's plans. The might of entire empires and age-old institutions undone by this seeming nobody, who somehow is always the one upsetting the status quo. Whether it's upstart colonies outlasting the most powerful empire on Earth, a ragtag bunch of heroes out to change the world, or a tiny clan in the mountains trying to get by. People love an underdog, and no matter how often they win, the House of Wolfort is always an underdog. Hello, back around the hearth one last time as we explore the northern continent of Norzelia. Norzelia. Wait a minute, and the last faction of significance that we directly see influence the world throughout the story. That, of course, being the central House of Wolfort, the warrior clan that never quite fit in with anyone else, and yet managed to seize power again and again, changing history across the continent. And it began in a predictably unassuming way. So the legends say, a lone warrior followed a hawk northeast of the then Kingdom of Glenbrook, into unsettled lands where many tribes, including the tribes of Falks and Telior, lived. This warrior found a mountain and started building a hall, and from that hall he began unifying the tribes into the single greater House of Wolfort. For an untold period of time, the House of Wolfort would remain the best independent figure in Norzelia, possibly even existing before the Duchy of Esfrost broke away from the kingdom. Wolfort's capital began to grow from the same mountain until it naturally grew into one of the best defended cities in Norzelia, and one of the most comfortable to live in. With special canals that help carry away waste and secretly can be filled with oil to trigger war crimes, the people of the Wolfort domain grew comfortable, honest, and simply kind folk that, like their leaders, often didn't worry much about continent-spanning ambitions. It's not clear entirely how far their domain stretched at that point, but I think it likely included parts of modern-day Telior and possibly most of Falk's domain. But for certain, the central region between the two rivers has always been Wolfort territory. In this agrarian society, every citizen could sustain themselves off the land and with total trust in their lord to protect them, leaving the worries of the other nations far beyond their minds. But, of course, one can only remain uninvolved for so long. Tensions broiled with the nations around them. Esfrost and Glenbrook were burdened by the taxes on salt due to the monopoly Hyzant held with the source, and the two nations schemed and strategized to undo this. Ultimately, they launched a surprise invasion of Hyzant, leaving the theocracy very little time to get into a defensive position, as Esfrost tore past their borders and besieged their capital city. At the last minute, the Hierophant of Hyzant sent a message to the ruling lord of Wolfort, Simon, a proud, glory-seeking warrior who, for reasons all his own, would respond to the call and lead an elite force across the desert and rivers to attack the sieging army of Esfrost. The frankly reckless attack shattered Esfrost's hold as Hyzant was able to fight back and send the war into a more even playing field. The battle lines of the Salt Iron War had been drawn, and it would devastate the continent. Wolfort felt this drastically, as even in the modern day there are abandoned villages in their territory which appear to have been left to ruin due to or following the Salt Iron War. The war proved a distinguishing time for House Wolfort, where the legends of their warriors could become known. Simon was the most obvious, considered to be an unparalleled warrior, save for perhaps by the greatest generals of Esfrost and Hyzant. But so too were those who fought beside and for him, such as Landroy Fox, leader of the Falks clan, an archer who went into battle alongside Simon, or Gorde Telior, advisor to Simon. There were furthermore his retainers and confidants, Benedict Pascal and Erator Ballantine, who may have gone less overtly praised, but they too served Wolfort spectacularly. Erador was a living wall of a man whose endurance would outlast the war, while it was Benedict's bold and sometimes brash plans that snatched victory from the jaws of defeat time and time again. Altogether, they made the Wolfort army feared and respected by keeping back the armies of Esfrost and Glenbrook from the shuddering Hyzant. But not all was well with the two sides. The salt reserves of Esfrost and Glenbrook began to run dry as Glenbrook's king Regna grew dissatisfied with the war Esfrost had drug it into. Meanwhile, Wolfort's ally of Hyzant was too busy burning itself to the ground to really be helpful. The Hierophant died of illness and caused a power struggle in the middle of the war, and to further exacerbate their problems, the Roselle, the enslaved people who Hyzant forced to produce the salt that fueled their economic power, revolted, and waves of them fled the Holy State. Many found their way into Wolfort territory, and their leader Orlea made a deal with Simon, relegating space for a Roselle village not too far from the Wolfort capital. Somewhere in here, or sometime following, Simon became disillusioned with the war and his ally in Hyzant, seeing the whole affair as pointless and overly costly. So, when he received an invitation from King Regna to secret negotiations, he took the offer, and together they orchestrated the end of the Salt Iron War by leveraging their better-equipped armies against the exhausted Esfrost and Hyzant. As a part of this deal, they created the Norzelia Consortium to regulate trade between the monopolies that had led the war to begin with. Next, the Wolfort clan would become vassals of Glenbrook as a powerful, unified opposition to the other two nations. It was not entirely even, however, as Regna had the House of Wolfort split into three, with the main domain held by Simon, while Gorde and Telior were named fellow High House lords and given land further away from Wolfort. This was to weaken the formidable Wolfort, just in case their ambitions grew. This anticipated ambition was also something Regna was kind of hoping for, since he was dueling with the Royalists, an unwieldy faction of nobles that entrenched themselves further into the politics and bureaucracies of the kingdom. He had hoped the new high houses would create a counterbalance that the Royalists would be unable to compete with. But ironically, the ambition he feared and counted on did not manifest. The simpler, more honest souls of Wolfort were expressed in their lords, who came from it. None of the high houses sought to increase their power, only to govern their own lands and keep their people happy. Landroy secured the southern grainlands, Gorde occupied and oversaw the vital reservoir to the north, and Simon remained on the front line as a vanguard between his new king and the bitter Esfrost and Hyzant. In this new status quo, things were still rocky in the new expanded Glenbrook, particularly because of a certain incident with the king and a woman named Destra. Now, this is a story that has gone unmentioned up to this point for one obvious reason. It only matters to the story of Wolfort, and because if you played the games, you likely know what I'm about to talk about. In the years right after the Salt Iron War, Regna met a common-born woman named Destra, and began a whirlwind affair with her, one which led to her getting pregnant. Regna was left with a few terrible choices. One, he could admit to it and try to legitimize the child and Destra, creating a scandal that would likely end in Destra and their baby being killed by royalists who'd hate for such a scandal to tarnish the image of the nobles and the royals. Or he could just brush her off and abandon her to a life as a single mother in a medieval setting, with the constant chance for the royalists to assassinate her anyway. So, once more, Simon Wolfort came to the rescue. In the service of the king, it would seem he too had met Destra, and he too had fallen in love with her. On seeing the sorry state that she was in, Simon agreed to take her in, marry her, and claim the child as his own. Regna agreed and sent a royal signet ring as a proof of the child's origin, just in case the truth ever had to be known. So it was done, with Destra becoming the lady of House Wolfort and beloved quickly by its people, most especially Benedict, who was in awe of her, and grew resentful of how she was treated by Regna and even Simon to an extent. This awe and admiration grew into deep devotion as he and Eredor served Wolfort in the decades after, alongside helping to raise the son she'd have. Born of royal blood to a common mother and raised as the son of a warrior lord, Serenoa Wolfort's past would remain shrouded for most of his life, as Eredor taught him to fight, Benedict taught him to think, and Simon taught him to lead. Serenoa grew to be a capable swordsman and effective leader, though he often fell short of the comparisons to his heroic father. He came to be loved and trusted by Wolfort, and while Destra would pass away in the ensuing decades, her impact continues to influence the decisions of those left behind. Benedict, remembering how she was traded around like a pawn, swore to lead her son to greatness, and Simon hoped only for Serenoa to grow into his role as lord of his house, a role Serenoa would have to take sooner than most, as Simon's health became tenuous. A failing heart and a body racked by old wounds, Simon knew his days were numbered. By the time we reach the events of Triangle Strategy, Glenbrook and the High Houses are at the forefront of the Grand Norzelian Mines project, designed to cool rising tensions between Esfrost and, well, everyone that isn't Esfrost. It set up two important signs of unity. The first was the mines themselves in Wolfort territory with Esfrosti techniques, and the second was the betrothal of the Esfrosti Archduke's half-sister Frederica to Serenoa as a further show of support. Frederica, daughter to Orlea and the former Archduke, returned to the land where her mother's people had found rest and was able to marry into the house of the man who allowed it to happen. With her came her cousin, Dragan, whose understanding of explosives made him an excellent choice for overseer to the mines. With this new age set to begin, Simon graciously abdicated his title and handed his son a final gift, the Scales of Conviction, a seemingly magical device which responds to the convictions and ideals of those who interact with it. With 7 tokens, chosen people vote upon a dedicated path, and the House of Wolfort follows it implicitly. The choice of who would hold these tokens is a monumental one, and Serenoa chooses wisely soon after. The 7 tokens are given to Benedict, Eredor, Frederica and her tutor Gila, Serenoa's best friend and the second prince of Glenbrook Roland, and his retainer Huette, and Anna, Benedict's adoptive daughter and another retainer and trusted confidant to Serenoa. These 7, with the input and the deliberation of Serenoa, would become the backbone of House Wolfort and the Scales, which would be much needed as the hoped peace would not last. Conflict arose over the discovery of salt crystals in the Grand Norzelian mines, known only to a select few, specifically Dragan and Esfrost's Archduke Gustadolf, but as we know by now, it ended with Dragan dead and Esfrost invading Glenbrook to cover their tracks while also trying to steal the mines. In a moment, the defenses of the High Houses collapsed. Serenoa was busy at the mines trying and failing to protect Dragan. Simon's forces were stalled by him suffering a near-fatal heart attack upon hearing the news of Esfrost's invasion, which sent him into a coma. Landroy Fawkes was too far in the south and received word too late to help, and Intelior, the son of Gorde, Silvio, was lord, and he left Glenbrook to fend for itself to preserve him and his own domain. Serenoa's forces alone tried to break into the capital to save the royal family, but they were separated from Regna and his other children, Crown Prince Franny, who was killed in front of them, and Princess Cordelia, who was taken prisoner. With only Roland in their care and his mentor Maxwell presumed dead in the process, the Second Great War of Norzelia had begun while Serenoa spirited Roland away to safety. Triangle Strategy's story, as you likely know by now, expands from here based on the story and gameplay effects of the Scales of Conviction, and the 7 main characters whose ideals shape the path House Wolfort takes. For the most part, Frederica represents naturally humane ideas associated with liberty. Roland has a more straightforward, honor-bound sense of morality, while Benedict's proposals tend to center around pragmatic utility. The rest of the characters tend to follow whoever they're closest to, though Anna and Eridor are just as often undecided. Bit by bit, Serenoa's own resolve is tested as he trusts in the decisions made by his peers and by the scales of conviction. Whether it's to abandon or protect Roland, to ally with the traitorous Silvio, or go along with a corrupt Byzantine minister who wants to drag them into his schemes. The path forward is determined by the choices of the entire house, and Serenoa executes their choices. Sound familiar? Though somewhat obfuscated and on a smaller level, House Wolfort functions like a two-level republic almost. 7 representatives of the entire house and a single leader who does not vote but instead executes the decisions made and adheres to them. He can persuade and debate with others to alter their decisions, but at the end of the day, he does not vote. He only acts upon what is decided. This has a habit of making Serenoa come across as, ironically, without convictions of his own, but that could not be further from the truth. In fact, his convictions are rooted in the combined knowledge and wisdom of the scales. That is also his weakness. Often Serenoa will follow the decisions enforced by the scales of conviction independent of his own feeling, and this results in some painful choices for him. Even so, he pushes on. The corruption of the Byzantine minister Sorceley, who had ingratiated himself to Wolfort, is revealed regardless of the path chosen, and Serenoa is put into a position to take his place as one of the saintly 7 of Hyzan, a dark reflection of his own council. But unlike his own, in Hyzant all is secretly ordained by Idor del Mira, Minister of Religion. If you want his whole deal, I've got a video of his and Hyzant's story you should watch. The Cliff Notes is this. He is a puppet master with a false hierophant that he pretends to hear the words of and instead merely speaking for. And this puppeteer demands Serenoa as a minister of Hyzant hand over the Roselle within his territory, betraying the promise and legacy of his father. This, as we've spoken of a few times before, can go a few ways with worse consequences if you do the obviously terrible thing. Again, to avoid rehashing what I've already talked about in a past video, we'll keep this brief. Serenoa gets Hyzant on his side, whether through capitulating or leveraging the discovery of salt crystals against them. They attack Glenbrook's capital and retake it, and Serenoa begins to feel the weight of Hyzant bearing down on him to leave Glenbrook to serve them. Soon, Simon awakes from his coma and reaches out to his son. Of course, you can choose to just outright ignore him if you like, but not if you want the golden ending. More on that later. Shortly after this and other crossroads, several world-shaking events happen in Serenoa's life. First, his father is assassinated by nobles from Glenbrook, who sought to use the confusion to end the High Houses and their control once and for all. Frederica discovers the true history of Norzelia and the past of the Roselle. Roland annihilates the last of the nobles in brutal fashion that begins to fray the public's trust in him, his own faith in the country he leads and his ability to lead it. They discover the salt crystals in the Grand Norzelian mines, and last but most certainly not least, Serenoa learns the truth of his lineage. He is presented with the royal signet and told either by Simon or Benedict the true story of Destra. All of this happens in like a week. It's a wonder Serenoa doesn't have a heart attack himself at this point. With so much before them and all their enemies gearing up to fight for the salt crystals, we reach the point we've discussed in every video so far. The final choice and the defining moment of many characters, especially Serenoa. Frederica insists they free the Roselle and escape to their homeland of Centralia, leaving Norzelia and its problems behind. Roland, crushed by the weight of responsibility, wants to hand the salt crystals to Hyzant and allow their cruel and false sense of equality to rule. Meanwhile, Benedict wishes to ally with Esfrost to snuff out Hyzant, and he suggests to Serenoa that he use his secret lineage to usurp Roland, seizing control and becoming the king Benedict always knew he could become. And you must decide as well. And you must decide how to convince the others who aren't the primary leaders. Everyone else can be coerced, but they are set in their ways and unwilling to reconcile their beliefs with one another. To take one side is to alienate another irreversibly, and Serenoa knows it. So once more, he must swallow his feelings as the tokens are cast and a decision is made. If Frederica gets her way, Benedict will refuse to abandon the domain he has protected and the past that he is chained to, even to the point of drawing a blade against his lord. Similarly, Roland can't abide allying with Esfrost, and upon Benedict revealing Serenoa's true lineage, he challenges his brother to a duel for the fate of Glenbrook. And Frederica, well, do you expect her to do nothing when you sell out her entire people? So, yes, of course Frederica drops the son on him. Every time, Serenoa's convictions overpower those who stand against him as he bends himself to the whims of the scales, choosing not to object but abiding by whatever decision is made no matter who he loses in the process. But every decision leaves him trapped. Roland's path leaves him trapped in a gilded cage where pieces of facade over the pain and misery others must suffer to create it, as he turns a blind eye to said suffering for his friend's vision. In Benedict's path, he becomes trapped by the old man's regret and spite, his desire to reshape Serenoa and Glenbrook into something that will always be remembered, something that is wholly different from who Serenoa really is. And even in Frederica's path, he loses his people and becomes trapped in the state of incorporeality as he becomes atomized by an exploding Edor. Listen, if you want context to that, watch the other videos. I've done this 4 times already. All these paths lead to Serenoa's sacrifice. Sacrifice of life, sacrifice of heart, sacrifice of autonomy. That is why the golden ending is the one path that only he could make. The golden ending requires Serenoa to do just about everything right. First, he has to not use the oil traps in Wolford, whether because he abstained from using it while Esfrost invades or because you hand over Roland to prevent it. Then you have to agree to smuggle salt for Sorcery, which allows Serenoa to meet with and convince Frederica's uncle, aka Dragan's grieving father, Svarog, to ally with you. You also have to refuse to hand over the Roselle, and lastly travel to meet Simon personally before he is assassinated, for him to reveal the truth to Serenoa himself. Do all these things, and the way forward is left open. A path Serenoa is able to see and decide for himself. One that does not rely on the scales of conviction. Setting the scales aside, Serenoa puts his own convictions forward, rather than swallowing them in the name of consensus. And by doing so, he allows the others to grow as well. He divides his army into 3, with Benedict defending Wolfort, while Roland buries his hate and doubt to seek Esfrost's aid, giving Frederica the chance to free the Roselle. Benedict uses the oil traps to successfully ward off the Byzantine army, and Roland and Svarog take down Gustadolf once and for all, with Frederica and the Roselle meeting up with them and their new Esfrosti allies to plan the assault on Hyzant. In short order, Serenoa leads the unified army to break the Byzantine army, shatter the walls of their city that they called the Goddess's Shield, and convince the second-to-last minister of Hyzant and the only one left with an ounce of redeemable qualities, Lila Viscraft, to stand down. All that is left is Edor, the man whose 6 schemes threatened the continent as much as any other. Edor once faced a conundrum just like Serenoa. In the Salt Iron War, when the Hierophant died, suddenly the Saintly Seven turned on each other and splintered due to infighting, much as Serenoa almost faced. And not too unlike Serenoa, rather than capitulating to the whims of the squabbling, he crafted his own plan for the future. But unlike Serenoa, Edor did not trust those around him. Instead, he looked down on and manipulated them. And now, with no other options, he channels the last of his power and the power of the Aelfric into himself, to achieve a state equivalent to a demigod, so that in his new immortality he might force his future upon Norzelia, free of the same discontent he and Serenoa were plagued by. Serenoa learned what Edor couldn't, however. He saw the way to dream for better and make it so, to finally be rid of all doubts. So Edor battles the army of Wolfort, comprised of people from every corner of the land. From former enemies, bandits, merchants, blacksmiths, the greatest generals and warriors of this and the previous generation, and the 7 souls who've shouldered this path with their leader so far, and the lone demigod who could not trust anyone but himself collapsed in defeat. Edor dies believing that even if Serenoa creates a brighter future, the stupidity and selfishness of man will tear it down. And while he may be right, Serenoa will not stop walking forward. For so long as he does that, there will always be a better future to fight for. As the new Norzelia is unified under a revivified Glenbrook, new, more autonomous territories are established from the regions. Gone are the royalist Saintly Sevens and High Houses, and instead the lands of Esfrost, Hyzant, and Wolfort are given each a governor to watch over them in the king's stead. Svarog for Esfrost, Lila for Hyzant, and of course, the hero of this war and the young hawk himself, Serenoa, as governor of the Wolfort domain. After great trial and strife, doubt and misfortune, the Lord of Wolfort had at last lived up to the dreams of his fathers and mother, become the man Benedict had hoped he'd become, been the friend Roland had needed, and become the man Frederica loved. His role centered these 3, and allowed them to fulfill their deepest desires without sacrificing anything else in the process. Because sometimes what a person needs most is someone to tell them they're wrong, and offer another way. And and in so doing he'd create the perfect conditions for Frost to rise from the ashes, Glenbrook to be cleared of corruption, Hyzant to shake off its gilded chains, and the Roselle to live freely. In the coming Norzelia, Sereno would not become a king, a saint, or a martyr. He'd become what he'd always wanted to be, a man and lord equal to, if not greater, than his father. And that will be all for Norzelia. Triangle strategy left an indelible impact on me, for being the right combination of tactical gameplay and immersive decision-making, which immersed me not only in the battles, but the characters who were involved in them. It is oft overlooked, and it occasionally has some funky dubbing even though I love it. Shay Matheson, I've seen you play Kamaravi and Xenoblade, I know you're a great VA, don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Despite this, it's a great encapsulation of everything that makes tactical RPGs wonderful, and I can only hope that more people get into this game. If you're watching this and have never played it, well, what are you doing here? I thank you for coming this far, but really, what are you doing here? Luckily for you, I didn't cover every nook and cranny of the characters in this game. I never even explained the deal with Evlora, or Anna's backstory, or who Milo is, or Travis and Trish. Can you believe I got this far without ever talking about Travis or Trish? Needless to say, while it's kinda funky if this is how you did find it, I still heavily suggest you pick up Triangle Strategy and give it a playthrough for yourself, because there is still so much to enjoy and much greater depth than I can convey in these videos alone. A great big shout out to all my lovely patrons, whose contributions encourage me to keep up the good work. If you'd like to support the channel, consider becoming a patron or a YouTube member for just $3 a month, for which you can gain access to early content, a private Discord to hang out in a little community, and more ways to directly interact with me. It's all just optional, however, and if you can't or don't want to, that's fine too. Just watching this video does a lot, as does liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing. That bell also lets you know whenever I post next, which tends to be weekly on every Saturday. So far, I've kept that streak up for the last 6 months or so, which is a pretty good record. Now, I've got more videos planned in the coming weeks, and a series I've been hoping to get to for a while, and I hope you all stick around for that one too. But until then, I have been the Hearth Guy, and say it with me now, I will see you all next time, around the hearth.